Certainly, there's a lot of members of the Peace Committee and a lot of people who've been through this program who do serve on the different peer review and programmatic review panels for it. And so this is a bit cobbled together. We're still trying to figure out the best way to do this part. But in essence, it's because of feedback from PALs and CALs and people who participated that we need to do a little bit more than we've done in the past to help help you guys, provide you with the information that you need to serve on these panels, and not just for the CDMRP, but there's lots of other organizations that are now involving what are generally called consumers, meaning PALs, CALs, research ambassadors in these processes. So the CDMRP, Congressionally Directed Medical Research Program, has been around since the early 90s, and it originally started as a breast cancer program. And it truly was a grassroots thing where there was advocacy and to Congress that said, we needed to have more research funding for breast cancer, and they appropriated this money. And so this was in 1993. And when they designed it from the very beginning, they said, okay, we're going to do this, and we're going to have this, what we call a two-tier review process, meaning scientific review and programmatic review. And we'll talk about what that means in a moment. And most importantly, that every aspect of vision setting and programmatic review and reviewing grants, that we need what the DoD calls consumers, PALs, CALs, or different for the different diseases, involved into everything that we do: policy, investment strategy, review, because that's really what matters. And over the years, different diseases got added to this program, to the CDMRP. And so the ALS research program was added in 2007. And so now there's like a whole panel of them, of different diseases, and they all follow this basic model. And so there've been, as it says, hold on, it's like my screen's goofing up. I don't know why. Okay. You guys can see my screen, right? Yeah, I hope. Okay. So, there've been over 2,000 consumers representing over, as it says here, 1,000 different organizations on different peer review panels, programmatic review panels for the CDMRP. And so, what is peer review and where did it come from? And yesterday, Kristalina was talking to us about some of the initial ethical research in syphilis. It's interesting, the very first, NIH study section, kind of the beginning of peer review, was actually in 1946. And it was about, a debate to find different treatments for syphilis. And that really was the first time in the entire world where decisions about research funding, scientific funding, were being made by some panel of experts rather than just, investors or some old boys network or the university uppity ups or whoever it might be. And so the study sections, and there were 12 study sections originally, but that syphilis was the first one. But some of them were specific diseases, some of them were types of science. And they didn't just review proposals, they also took it upon themselves to kind of do a survey of the research landscape. And they really wanted to figure out what were the most exciting emerging investigations that could potentially lead to breakthroughs. And this idea of peer review and these peer review panels, this was something that truly started at NIH in the US. And then, really was a big reason that we led the world in this field for a long time. And this model was adopted by, not surprisingly, foundations and other funding organizations, and has been the model since then. And, this is a slide actually from a different talk and not necessarily what I'm going to talk about today, but we have to improve this model because of some issues related to how it slows down research sometimes. It hasn't really changed in 75 years, but that's not what we're going to talk about right now. But the way it works is that, there's a funding organization, right? And so there's a funding cycle. Some organization decides they want to fund grants about something or grants to try and do something. And so they prepare and send out a program announcement or a request for applications. And they say, okay, we're sending this out and now you've got a certain number of months to respond to it. And then scientists, write a proposal. And sometimes there's a preliminary proposal, what's called a letter of intent or a pre-proposal, a kind of a short version. And the reason that exists is because, funding is limited. And if you're able to fund 3 grants and you get 200 proposals, well, that's just silly. And so sometimes there's a round of pre-proposal evaluation that helps narrow that down to a much more manageable number based on certain criteria. And then after that round, people are invited to submit the full proposal if they meet those specific outlined criteria. So after that, peer review panels are established. And as we just heard that, peer review panels often are established as needed. So they may be made up of particular expertise or particular sizes or particular numbers, depending on the response to a given program announcement. I will tell you this year, let's see, how can I say this? Rumor is that the response has been excellent. And so I suspect that there will be quite a demand for peer reviewers this year. So, each grant is assigned to a couple reviewers, and scientists, experts, consumers, they do a detailed review, and then there's a meeting, right, of the entire committee, and each proposal is discussed and voted and scored, and there's different criteria to rank the different parts. And by the way, prior to all of that, everybody gets training. There's a company that does it for the DoD on how to do this and how to review them and what the criteria are. So it's not like you're left on your own for any of that sort of thing. And so then there's something that comes out of that peer review, and then that often goes to a second level of review. So at NIH, there's something called NIH Council, and for the DoD, we call it Programmatic Panel, that does yet another layer of review. Often it's not re-reviewing the science, but it's somehow based on portfolio priorities or comparing the different proposals. And then things get funded, and then, contracts get executed. And so you can imagine this is kind of a long process to go through all of this. This is what it looks like for the ALS, for the DoD's, the ALSRP, the program that we're talking about right now. So each year there's an annual appropriation. And by the way, we can't start the process each year until the NDAA, the DoD budget gets formalized. And sometimes that compresses some parts of this. But we have a programmatic panel and we have peer review panels. And so the programmatic panel has consumers on it, and the peer review panels do also. We meet once a year to do what's called vision setting, to look at what are going to be our priorities, what kinds of funding mechanisms are we going to release. We release those announcements, we get the pre-applications back. Those pre-applications, these are the shorter version ones, get screened. And this, by the way, is happening in the next month right now. This is where we are in the schedule right now. And then we invite people to submit a full application, and then that's what goes to the peer review panels, and then to the programmatic review, and then we make those funding decisions. And so this is, not dissimilar from the way other organizations do it. But here's the rub, right? So only a small percentage of proposals can get funded in a given cycle. And so whether it's DoD or something else, the peer reviewers have to make really hard decisions. And you got to make decisions about what's the impact and what does impact mean? And, are the experiments well designed, and are the scientists qualified? And one of the things that we definitely struggle with in ALS, right, is that a lot of those considerations have to be related to what are the targets. We talked yesterday about, the science, how do we find targets? What are the pathways that are being targeted? What are the models, the mice, the cells, all the things we discussed yesterday? Are they appropriate for this kind of research? And it can be difficult to judge until we actually know what works, right? Like we were talking about, so there's this SOD mouse, right, which we think is a great mouse model for ALS, but maybe not for all kinds of ALS. But we don't really know which models, which iPS cells, which mice, whatever it might be, are going to be the most meaningful ones until, we're truly able to develop therapies based on them. So the first tier of peer review for the DoD is the first tier that you guys participate in after those pre-applications come back, is what's called peer review. And so it's a technical process, right? It's about, you get these long grants and you have to review them, and they've got all these parts, and there's a lot of technical science, and it's like, oh my gosh. And I'll tell you what, the refrain that I hear from consumers most, whether they're on programmatic panels or peer reviewers, is, shit, I don't want to say anything's bad. Like, how do I know? What if I give something a bad score and that's why it doesn't get, funded? And so how am I qualified to make that judgment? And we'll talk about that in a few minutes too. But these panels are composed of scientists, of consumers. Every year they're staffed up based on what the needs are. And much like when Terry was just talking, in our plan eventually is to have a separate sort of a curriculum where we have some exercises that you guys do for this. We're still kind of working out the best way to do it, but with some example grants. But a grant's not that different from a research paper. It's got an abstract. Oftentimes there's a separate, what's called a lay abstract, which is meant to be less technical. It's got aims, and so the aims sort of spell out what the project's going to do, right? Aim 1, aim 2, aim 3. Aim 1, we're going to test a drug in a particular cell. Aim 2, we're going to try different dosages of that drug. Aim 3, we're going to take that drug and try it in some mice, or something like that. It lays out what are the main parts of the strategy. And then there's a detailed science dense part that gives, the background. Why are we doing this? What's our preliminary data that says this is good rationale? Here's the details of what we're planning. What if our experiments don't work? Like, what else can we try? What are the alternatives if this experiment doesn't work? And then what are we going to do next? And that's the research strategy that I think is most intimidating a lot of times for peer reviewers. And we're going to talk a little bit about how to address it. There's also other parts of grant proposals. So one of them is a separate impact statement also, like how does this impact the field? How is this important? There's often a data sharing plan. What are the plans for sharing the results of this openly and broadly? There's obviously details about the people doing the experiments. Are they qualified? Are they the right people? About the facilities, do they have the right tools, collaborators, the budget? Different parts of this are what's called scored, and in different mechanisms that varies. And different parts of this are evaluated by different people. So as a consumer reviewer, you may be asked to specifically look at, for example, the lay abstract and the impact statement. And you're given, criteria to do that. So, we survey everyone who does this sort of review, and we get back, not surprisingly, because you guys are all amazing, really, really detailed information about the experience and what to do. This is just excerpts from one person's, it was about a 5-page thing about, this particular mechanism that they were reviewing. And they said that they didn't feel like they were carrying their part of the load. And part of that was because this was a very technical, proposal mechanism, and it had a lot of science in it, and they weren't familiar with the science. And, we realized upon reading this sort of thing, so number one, this is why we have things like this CRLI to teach you guys about how to do research, about how we do the science, about how we make, how we do things in the lab, and that's really important. But also, the things that are being listed as concern here aren't necessarily as important as you might think to evaluating grant proposal. And then oftentimes we use the reviewer comments to help us refine our instructions to researchers, right? To make sure that they understand what we want them to put in these sections and what they should be like. And we do this every year. So, this is what Terry said at the beginning of the last session, right? You don't have to be a scientist to think critically. And this is 100% true. This is my version of that. So my family used to own a gourmet store, and I was an indentured servant through medical school and my PhD. And in the gourmet store, I ran the beer department, right? I was a beer salesman. And I'll tell you what, that's how I learned how to sell and how to talk to people and know your audience. But I also I coordinated some big beer festivals, and I got to meet all the breweries and, and I was if there's such a thing, it kind of sounds silly, but a beer advocate, right? Because this was a long time ago when people didn't know that there were all these different kinds of beer, and craft meant macaroni and glue, not like craft beer. But anyway, as I got involved in this community, I actually became a beer judge, right? I got invited to judge in a beer competition, and I was like, what the heck? Why would brewers care about me? I don't know about this science, and I don't know what I'm doing. And I actually took a course on how to become a beer judge, where they taught me about the science and all the rest of that. It's not actually that different than what we're doing right now for ALS, to be honest with you. But the first time I sat down to do this, the first time I sat down to judge one of these, I'm like, holy crap, I have no idea what to do. There's all this detailed stuff I'm supposed to write and read, and I'm completely unqualified. And, what I realized was that as long as I understood the task, and as long as I understood my role and what the guidelines were, that actually my passion about this and the fact that I had on my own gone and learned about all of this information and studied it, and I really was qualified as long as I understood what it was that I was being asked to do and what the task was. And so this is the important part of being a reviewer, right? You got to understand your role. You got to know, what are your marching orders? What is the purpose of different funding mechanisms, right? And there's different kinds. So sometimes there can be a mechanism that's designed to help us figure out very basic stuff about how our cells work that has nothing to do with developing therapies. Sometimes mechanisms can be specifically about developing a drug. Those are two different kinds of funding mechanisms. A grant that's a good fit for one is not a good fit for the other. Sometimes there's things called pilot grants, right? So a grant where maybe it's a brand new idea that who knows if it's going to work, maybe it's going to fail miserably, but this is a way to get some new information really quickly on something that might be really innovative. We sometimes call those high risk, high reward, right? The implication of high risk, high reward is that most of those are going to flame out, okay? And reviewers often don't realize this, and they say, oh, well, I'm going to rank this one higher because, you know, they've got some more preliminary data, and so I think they have a better chance of maybe getting these experiments to work. No, that's not the purpose of a high risk, high reward. A high risk, high reward is you know, really innovative, and a lot of them are going to be high risk. They're not going to work. And so, you know, understanding these different ways to evaluate things and what are the criteria. Whenever you're on a committee for any of this sort of thing, you're given these scoring criteria. And the first thing you should do is not sit down and try to read grants. The first thing you should do is sit down and say, what are they asking me to do? Make sure you understand it. Make sure you understand what is the purpose of the funding mechanism, okay? Make sure you understand which sections are scored. For example, sometimes the data sharing section is not scored. Sometimes it is. Sometimes personnel is scored. And then also, like, why are we scoring things? Like, this isn't like your report card for high school, right? What does it matter? What happens to these numbers? What the heck? If I give something a 1, which is the highest score, or a 5, which is the lowest score, so what? Like, does that matter? And why and how? And so all of this is the kind of stuff that before you sit down and get worried about, oh my God, I don't understand this, you need to spread out. And you can even make yourself cheat sheets about these things, and we all do it. And you need to ask questions. So I mentioned that in the DoD, we have this first step where we pre-application screen, and that's done by the Programmatic Panel, which I chair. And by the way, I should have mentioned up front, so I chair this panel. It's a volunteer position. I'm not an employee of the DoD. I don't speak for them. I'm not speaking for them right now. It's a privilege and honor to be able to do this. This program wouldn't exist if not for advocates and, you know, pals and cows in the first place. And I love it, but I'm not an employee of the DoD. This is an excerpt of things that I send out each year to our new panel members that sort of like tips about, because when we do this pre-application score, I'll tell you what, like new reviewers on the panel, they freaking give everything a 1, right? And honestly, that doesn't help. You know, if everything's a 1, what's the deal? And so this is sort of some little tips that I personally made up that kind of give us an idea about what are we doing when we're screening and trying to make the list number. And I don't want to read these to you, but I just wanted to put them to make a couple points here, right? So this is this first step. It's a simple step. It's a 5-point scale, okay? And so yeah, 1 is one that I don't even want to talk about at our meeting. We're just going to invite them to submit because it's that good, okay? 2 is something that I want to invite, but there's somebody else reviewing this. And if they have a reservation, you know, we should discuss it, because if they get a 2 and they also get a 4 or 5, we're going to talk about it together. So this is how the scoring influences what happens next. 3, you know, means that I kind of want to talk about this because guess what, man, I don't quite understand the science, and that's common. And that's why these are panels and have lots of different wisdom on them. Or maybe I'm not sure if it really fits the mechanism. Maybe, you know, this is a mechanism that's supposed to be a pilot mechanism, and it doesn't seem like that. It seems like this is experiments that have been going on in this person's lab for years and years, and this is just like the next interval step. And so I'm kind of not sure about that. And the one thing that I want to make very clear here is that we get amazing grant proposals and all of these things that we really want to get funded, and we think they're so cool and such great ideas, and they're great science and great scientists, but they just don't fit the mechanism, okay? They're not what a particular funding mechanism was designed to do. And you can't feel bad about, you know, scoring that low if it's not the intent of this mechanism. You know, we get really sexy, cool research. It doesn't always mean that it fits. So when I say, you know, understand what you're supposed to do, and this is, so when you read the grants, like, look, this stuff is a moving target and it's confusing, but it's pretty easy if you distill it down to the things we spoke about yesterday, right? What's the comparison? What's the apple? What's the orange, right? What's being measured? Are they looking at something? I don't care if you understand what the something is. Something's either going up or it's going down, or it's changing, or it's in the wrong place, like the TDP 43, right? What's the comparison? Is the comparison in the lab experiment something that they have convinced you might be relevant, right? Might be relevant for whatever the thing is that they're trying to develop, okay? Maybe something's in the wrong place, maybe it relates to a disease. This is the real important one that I think gets overlooked. Science can be really fascinating and cool and make neat results, but what actually determines what happens next? You know, is there a go, no go at the end? What's the next thing that happens? If they finish this grant and they do exactly what they say they're going to do and they get the results that they think they're going to get, how does that change us from where we are today? And does that change match the, you know, what the mechanism was designed to do? Are the samples that they're using appropriate, right? So we talked about, you know, we got lots of different mice. This SOD mouse is a hugely valuable mouse model in ALS, but guess what? If I'm doing a study, as we talked about yesterday, on TDP 43, don't choose that mouse because it doesn't have it, okay? If I'm comparing human let's say autopsy tissues to something that I've done in a mouse or in cells, I have to make sure that I'm comparing the right flavor of ALS. I have to make sure, as we talked about, if I grind up cells, that's applesauce. Am I making a comparison to, to apple pie or to the frosting, is it correct? And you don't need to necessarily understand all of the technical science to understand what is the comparison. These are some common pitfalls that we see, right? Are the experiments feasible? Are they the right people to do it? Okay. Whether or not the results are going to be what they think they're going to be, have they done this kind of experiment before, this kind of chemistry? Do the methods actually work? Does the timeline make sense? I showed you this plot yesterday. This is from ceftriaxone, right? This is survival of mice. These mice live 150 days. So guess what? If my aim one of experiments say, I'm going to do something where I breed some mice, and then I'm going to treat those mice, at 130 days, and then I'm going to see what happens. And then based on which treatment works best, my aim two is that I'm going to take those things that work the best, and I'm going to do some chemistry on them. Well, if aim two is supposed to start 2 months after my experiment, after my proposal starts, that doesn't work, right? Because that would be like day 60. In those experiments, I'd still be breeding my mice, right? So does the time course make sense? Is it too ambitious sometimes? Are the statistics appropriate, right? One thing that we come across a lot in grants is, are there concerns with aim interdependence, right? Aim one, I'm going to breed these 2 mice and I'm going to make a mouse to model something. And then aim two, I'm going to use that mouse. Well, guess what? Sometimes you try to make a mouse and it doesn't work. And if you don't successfully make a mouse, you can't do aim two and you can't do aim three, and the whole thing falls apart, right? You'd rather have aims that are complementary instead of dependent on each other. Sometimes the name would be, we're going to do a screen for drugs that affect something in my lab, and then we're going to take the top hits. What happens if you don't get a hit, right? And how do you define a hit? What's top? What's good? And so these are just ways to think critically, and you don't necessarily need to know what's in the black box. So the second tier of review is programmatic review, and this is a standing panel that actually Terry's on and that I chair, and Nadia Sethi is on. She's one of our standing members of that panel as well. And so we take the outcome of that peer review panel, the evaluations and the scores, and then we compare them to each other. And we're not re-reviewing the science. We're saying, how do these different grants compare? How does it fit into our portfolio needs and our already funded grants, and what's going to have the biggest impact? And then we make the recommendations from that for what gets funded. This is the programmatic panel from this past year. Industry, academics, representatives of the various organizations. And these are the different things that the programmatic panel does. And so, we talk about what should the program be doing? How should we refine these mechanisms? We spend a lot of time figuring out, where is our place, right? How can we have the biggest impact in developing therapies for ALS? And so if this is what we call a therapeutic pipeline, so you've got early science like by the CDC on risks and exposures, and then basic science maybe predominantly funded by NIH. And then we've tried to fit into this piece here that's kind of the immediate preclinical and then early clinical now phase. And so we design mechanisms specifically for this. And so if somebody writes a grant to us that's investigating basic science that isn't about developing a therapy, that's not a good grant for us, even if it's cool science. Okay. If they're looking at the risk of lead, exposure in ALS, again, might be fascinating. That's not what our mechanisms are designed to do. To date, there's been about 150 million in appropriations across a bunch of different, this is just a pie chart showing that. Through FY19, we had 2 kinds of awards. We had one award that was called a Therapeutic Idea Award, high risk, right? New ideas, had to have an idea for therapy. And then the second mechanism that we had was called Therapeutic Development. And this was supposed to fund, we heard yesterday about IND enabling studies from Jinsey, right? About chemistry and tox and good manufacturing and all the stuff you got to do to get an IND, to get into a clinical trial. That stuff isn't sexy, and that stuff is not easy to get funded. And so this was something that we identified as a missing piece in the ALS funding pipeline. And so that's what this mechanism was supposed to do. So this was to get, ideally, if you have a new idea, you do this TIA award. And at the end of the TIA award, maybe you would be ready to apply for a TDA if your idea worked. Now, this is high risk, high reward. If your idea flamed out, that's fine. That's okay. But maybe you would be ready to move on. You can look through these later in the slides, but this is just some examples of some of the stuff that was awarded. And I want to point out here, because this is where it comes in, again, what's happened recently with this increase in funding. So I joined this committee in, I think, 2012. And we would get 85 or 90 proposals and we could fund 3, right? And so no matter how good of a job we did at peer review or designing these mechanisms or talking to our reviewers, like that's just not having an impact, and it's not fair, and it's a crapshoot. And researchers didn't want to apply because they're like, why am I wasting my time? Like, you're going to fund 1% or whatever you're doing, okay? And, we refined the mechanisms as best we could so that we made these numbers instead of 3, 7, 8, 9. What's happened over the past few years is because of unbelievable advocacy by you guys and several patient organizations, this funding rate has gone up, and so we are able to have an impact like never before. We funded 40 new awards last year. Freaking 40 awards. Think how much that moves the needle. Look at that, okay? Look at the difference. And each one of these awards is designed to help develop new therapies in ALS. When we found out in FY20 that we were likely going to have this funding increase, we didn't want to be 6 people in a room making a decision. So we surveyed the entire ALS research community, academics, government, PALs, CALs, industry, everyone. We sent out a survey to say, what should we do? How should we best use this money? And because we wanted the collective wisdom. Based on this survey, what we got back is that we should be prioritizing at that time innovative new ideas, these high risk, high reward. Biomarkers, we need stuff not to get to clinical trials, and even in early science has to involve them. And we need to be sharing data. And so we refined our mechanisms based on those things, based on input from the community, based on these surveys. We leveraged open data sharing. We actually added for the first time pharmaceutical industry representation to our panel because, if we're trying to de-risk trials for pharma, we need pharma's input to help us do that. We added a new award to specifically help with biomarker development and also help with looking at ways to optimize aspects of current ALS care, which really is not something that had been funded previously. That new mechanism, these are just some examples that were funded in that first year and the kinds of things, right? So this was ways to leverage existing resources, ongoing trials to help with biomarker development, to figure out, different subtypes of ALS, to figure out different measurements. The ROADS, the questionnaire that we've talked about as an endpoint was funded by one of these, to figure out ways to do, at-home measurements with a cell phone app that does bulbar progression, right? So this was amazing stuff that came out of this year 1. The next year, we found out that our funding was going to be going up to 40 million. And again, holy moly, that's amazing. And that, we really wanted to help move this. So now we have this portfolio of all this early stuff, this TIAs, and it made us really well positioned to move that stuff into the next step, right? Into the further along into the pipeline. And so I'll tell you what, back here, we were getting crap for those TDA mechanisms. The IND enabling studies, it was garbage. The reason we could fund more things here than here with the same budget was because we were only funding like 1 TDA a year, and they were expensive. And so we were using it on those other awards. But now we had this big portfolio, and now we were able to fund more of them and move them along. We also added a new pilot trial award, and the pilot trial award was designed specifically to have these biomarker-driven early clinical trials to help accelerate and inform, later trials, the platform trial, things that were really going to help speed up therapy development. And this is providing money so that we can fund the best things, not just the thing that somebody has money to move into a trial or, a pharma company that has a drug for something else. This, by the way, these are all the different CDMRPs. So we're just one of them, right? Here's our budget. Some of them are really huge. Some of them that have had more success in larger, later phase clinical trials are, like this breast cancer program, peer-reviewed medical, TBI. We're sort of in the middle. Again, if you just look at our funding rates, okay, last year that we funded over 40% across all of our mechanisms. That's unheard of in medical research, and it really, really makes a difference. And it makes a difference because of advocacy and the fact that we're able to do that. These were those 40 awards, and some of these are names you might recognize, some of them you won't, because it's a lot of new people entering this field because of this sort of thing, and because of, again, none of this would be possible without advocates and research ambassadors. Again, the budget this year is 40 million. We have gone through and refined these awards more. We met last year for vision setting. Nadia, we gave specific marching orders presented on the clinical trial landscape, biomarker landscape. How has the pandemic changed things was a big topic that we talked about, providing, extra money for people whose research might have been sidetracked by that. We improved our own mechanisms. this is, as you guys are probably familiar with, this is the ALS signal database that Nadia helped design for IMALS, and has all this amazing information. We gave Nadia specific homework for that meeting, and we said, we want to know across all of these trials, which ones have biomarkers and what kinds of biomarkers they are. And, and also what flavor of ALS is enrolling. And this is just a very simple output of this, but yesterday we talked about that we need pharmacodynamic biomarkers, right? And predictive biomarkers. If I have a therapy that's targeting a specific mechanism, I'd like to know who to give it to. And I'd like to know if I'm having the effect that it's having, okay? And so what this analysis showed us was that across all the current trials in ALS, only about half of them are doing any sort of biomarker work, right? Beyond sort of traditional endpoints. And even the ones that are, it's the very non-specific stuff. So neurofilament has promise for certain things, but realize neurofilament is not specific to ALS or a particular mechanism, right? Neurofilament is something that injured neurons squirt out. And what we really need is biomarkers that are specific to different treatments. And so that was what we refined these mechanisms to do for this current year. And we've just gotten them back in. And I'll tell you, each year it's fun to see, because it used to be we were all on the TIAs, and then we got more of these ones that are moving to INDs. And now we're getting more and more applications each year for pilot clinical trials for biomarker awards. By the way, you might have heard recently that NIH is now requiring every grant mechanism that they do to have a data sharing plan. It's still not a scored component for them. For us, it is. Okay, for us, we actually score data sharing. You can't just say, oh, I'm going to share my results at meetings and publish papers. You have to say how you're going to deposit your results in publicly available databases and resources and really share it. And it's part of our evaluation. So we also, if you go to the website for the DoD, we are maintaining a database of all sorts of research resources. And I sent a link yesterday in the chat when we were talking about ways to screen for clinical trials. There's even a list on that thing for the different ways to look up different clinical trials, but also just research tools for researchers. There's a nice, wonderful profile on Nadia and on the impact that she's had. Obviously, I love doing this kind of thing. It's like my favorite thing to do ever. We've got to figure out a way to have an actual curriculum where we're doing some like test grant reviews, because this is what we've been asked for by you guys, is to go through some proposals, much like we just did for a paper with Terry. The problem is there's just not enough time in these days. And so I really think it's something we're going to have to do as a separate kind of, standalone hour-long thing or something like that. But we definitely want to do it. We've also tried specifically several strategies to help. So what scared the heck out of me when this budget went up? I was like, oh crap, we just came out of the pandemic. What if our budget goes up and we don't get good science? What if we don't have good stuff to fund? And so we've worked very hard on increasing our visibility and making small pharma aware of these mechanisms and making international researchers aware of these mechanisms. And that's been a real push over the past few months. We have a Q&A with Joe Lukac up on the website. He's about, venture capital and small pharma outreach, and we're changing the makeup of our panels. And I'm talking too much, so I'm going to skip through this. But I just wanted to mention somebody, yesterday, in a common refrain we hear in ALS is, oh, they're doing this in cancer. Can't we do this? And so one of the other things that we're hoping to be able to implement. So I mentioned, this is a long cycle, right? Every funding cycle you apply and you got to wait for a long time. And even if you get funded, okay, even if a researcher's grant gets funded, it's still many, many months, okay, in the best case scenario, from when you come up with an idea and have some data to when you get funded to do it and can do those experiments. And so one of the things that we're working on is there a way that we can collaboratively work together to help researchers sort of seek alternative funding when, say, their grants don't meet our mechanisms, or maybe they just meet the funding cutoff. So this is going to be modeled on this thing in cancer. If you look it up, it's called the ICRP, the International Cancer Research Partnership. This is a effort where all of the various funders in cancer research, they code all their grants by topic, by mechanism, by what they're funding, by what they're releasing, and all the research around the globe. You can look, if you go on their website, you can look at it. You can look by where research is being done, what's the topic, who's funding what. And we've spoken to them at length about trying to reproduce something like this specifically for ALS. And they've given us all of their data dictionaries and their roadmap and their budgets. And so we have an outline to do this. And if we have something like this, one of the things that's going to perhaps let us do, which maybe is a little different than what they're doing, is we want to be able, if a researcher applies to us and we don't fund them, but the researcher gives us permission, we would like to be able to share their proposal perhaps with other funders in this space who may be more appropriate or may be interested in funding them, right? So they don't have to wait for another cycle. And so we actually included that language this year in the program announcement. So everyone who wrote a grant proposal to us this year could indicate whether, in the case that perhaps they don't get funded, whether they would, like us to share their proposal with other funding agencies who may be interested in funding them right away. And so we'll see. I mean, it's something that we're hoping to build on. There's a lot more information on the website. Please go to it. Please ask questions. I'm always happy to chat about anything, truly anything. And as I mentioned, there's a resource database there. And yeah, just send me an email. That's it.
Thanks so much. Let's see. We may have a few comments before we hear from Todd, who's actually, okay. Let's see. Dr. Ostrow, this from Kevin. What in your experience has been the percentage of 4 or 5 proposals?
So can you, so Kevin, what do you mean?
Those
the ones that get scored.
Scored 4s and 5.
Yeah, so it depends. So there's different things that get scored, and this is what there's just not enough time to go through all of this. But so in the first stage in the pre-application review, right, which is where we're getting these shorter versions, and that was the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 that I showed you. Okay, I would say that on average, and so we discuss anything that's a middle score. We automatically invite things that get like a 1 or 2 from both reviewers, right? We discuss middle scores. We also discuss, and this is something that we implemented, anything that's got a disparate score. So if one person gave a 2 and one person gave a 5, we're like, oh, we got to figure out why that is, because we don't want to miss it. We also allow anything to be championed. So we encourage people to, if things got a bad score, they can champion them and discuss them. I would say that on average right now for that pre-application review step, we probably get 130 pre-apps across all mechanisms, and we probably 80 of them get invited to submit full applications, okay? Those then go to peer review. Now, peer review is a much more detailed scoring. There's all those different domains that get scored. There's all these different, we don't have, by the way, a funding cutoff, a funding line, okay? We don't have, it's not like NIH where everything above a particular impact score gets scored, because what happens then is that those summary statements come back to us, to the programmatic panel. And then programmatic review, we don't re-review the science, but we again assign 2 more reviewers to review and score these proposals, again, based on different criteria. So peer review is on the individual merits of each proposal. Programmatic review is comparative. It's comparing the proposals to each other and to the portfolio. And for programmatic review, I'll tell you what, it varies from year to year and mechanism to mechanism. It takes the research field a year or 2 to get used to a new mechanism, right? And also, it takes our reviewers a few years sometimes to learn how to review them. Early on in those years I showed you, I will say there were a lot more 4s and 5s. People have gotten more savvy, and Terry will tell you it's an exhaustingly long day at programmatic review right now because we've got a lot to discuss. It's a lot easier when you can fund 40% as opposed to 5%. But I'll tell you, 5s are rare. 4s are not uncommon, and it's different for the different mechanisms. For the TIAs, which is the IDEA awards, they're probably less common than for the TDAs. The TDAs are the ones that are in IND enabling. We give lots of 4s because at the end of a TDA, you should be ready for an IND. At the end of a lot of TDAs that we receive, they're not ready for an IND. The other thing that are the sort of stuff we would talk about in a more formal curriculum, we often get proposals for TDAs that are a drug in search of a disease, right? So it's a company that has a drug that they have, a particular mechanism, and they're developing this for sleep apnea and Parkinson's, and they did a Google search and they're like, holy crap, look at that, ALS, right? And so they write a proposal to ALS because our mechanism can fund their tox and their manufacturing and their, the studies that are harder to get funded that they kind of need whatever they're going to use it for. And so we get a lot of those, and those obviously don't score well. We also similarly get proposals that are interesting from, say, a company that has a mechanism, but maybe they don't have the expertise to do the experiments. Like maybe they've done something in Parkinson's mice, but not ALS mice, right? And so we encourage people to partner with the proper expertise. And that's a reason that often grants might get a 4 or a 5, right? So it's not that they're necessarily a bad idea, but maybe they're the wrong people. So, that's a long-winded answer. I don't know if I answered what you asked, but there are specific reasons that people get 4s or 5s, based usually on mechanistic considerations, not whether or not it's a good idea for a therapy.
Yeah, and
Is the general who signs off from Army Futures Command?
Yes. So, well, so out of programmatic review, we have a list of recommendations for funding. That list of recommendations is always what gets funded, but you're right. They're the ones who that's a recommendation. I'll tell you what, one of the other cool things about this program, so there's something called indirect costs with grants, right? So there's funds that cost to buy your mouse, but then there's funds that your organization charges to keep the light bulbs and the toilet paper in the bathroom, all that kind of stuff. Those are different at different organizations. DoD negotiates with every academic center, every industry company separately. And so you don't always know how much a grant is going to cost, but we spend every freaking dollar. And what I mean by that is, and Terry will tell you, there's times where we get a proposal where AIM 1 looks amazing. AIM 2 and 3 really don't. Or we know because of who's on the programmatic panel that AIM 2 and 3 perhaps are funded by ALSA or by NIH, but we still really want them to do AIM 1. And if we have dollars left at the end of this, we will often offer researchers, we'll say, hey, we've got this amount of money left. We can't fund your full proposal, but could you use this to just do AIM 1? So we do whatever we can to spend every last penny.
Allison, you had a question also. You want to go ahead and ask it?
Yeah, so Lyle, my first year that I did the review, I was on the clinical trials panel, and it was such a great experience because I really felt like I had something to add. I could give a perspective for that. But my second year, I was on a panel that was the grants were really, really early in the process, and we were told to assess based on the impact to ALS families if they were successful. Yeah, and that I really struggled with.
Right. So I'm glad you asked that. And this is something, again, we really need to have a separate curriculum because that's one of the things we've identified. What is impact, right? And it gets really goofy in some of our award mechanisms that are the early ones, like you just mentioned, because if something's early science, like to a consumer, impact is how soon is this going to be a drug that I can use, right? But it depends on the mechanism. So one of our mechanisms is designed to figure out biomarkers, perhaps for different flavors of ALS, right? And so that mechanism is specifically designed to figure out who might respond, let's say, to a particular drug. And we would get reviews back that said, well, the impact here is low because it's only people who have this specific mechanism. And we were like, yeah, that's actually the whole point, right? The whole point is that we're trying to figure out who to use this drug in. That's why we designed the mechanism. So what we've tried to do, Allison, is refine the impact criteria. And that's what I meant about know your job. So specifically, we're trying to spell out very clearly, what do we mean by impact? And it's different for the different awards. For the TIA award, which is one of those early science one, at the end of the award, ideally, you're ready to apply for the next award, right? The impact is that you've taken some new idea and gotten it to a point where now you can do IND enabling studies. For a basic science biomarker development award, the impact isn't how soon is there going to be a drug. The impact is this going to help us figure out which patients to do this experiment in, right? If oftentimes consumer reviewers will see, okay, well, this only applies to SOD ALS or C9 ALS. So the impact's less because it doesn't apply to all ALS patients. Well, again, that's not necessarily what we mean by impact, but our job is to spell that out. And so before you sit down and read the grants, take a look at the criteria. And if they don't make sense, or if it's not clear what is meant by, impact, ask those questions. Because what we want to do, and again, it's like when I was judging beer, they didn't care about me telling them about the chemistry of how much, what the pH of their wort should be. But what was it that I was supposed to be evaluating and based on what criteria? And so we've tried to clarify that.
Alison, I would like to add, I share your view. For preclinical studies and very early on in research, for anyone, not only for the consumers, as Lyle calls them, is incredibly difficult to evaluate impact, if not impossible, because we are still very early in the process. I would say that the most important thing to judge is relevance to the disease,
Yeah.
which brings to significance. Everything else is a moot point, because as the chair of my last study session at the NIH always told us, if a study is not worth doing because it's not relevant, it is not worth doing it well. So forget about whether they are doing a good science or not. Those will be the different reviewers that will be asked specifically to evaluate the experimental procedure, right? And 90% of the cases, people who apply for this grant are able to figure out how to redirect their science because they do it for a living. The goal is not impact, because it's very hard to predict the long-term impact of a preclinical research. Relevance.
Yeah. So relevance
I
and
think that
feasibility.
that will be the most important.
Yeah. So feasibility too. And again, it depends on the different mechanisms. So we have a mechanism that's supposed to be high risk, high reward, right? The impact is still there if the experiment fails. So, or I shouldn't say the experiment fails. So you want to make sure the experiment's feasible, that the results are meaningful and interpretable. But if the results are, this is a bad idea, that's fine, right? So what you don't want is to have an experiment where at the end of it, you don't know anything more than you knew at the beginning of it. And so sometimes, you know, at the end of an experiment, the results are not what you expect, but you want the results to be interpretable and to be something that helps get an answer. And so we spell this out, you know, exactly right. So is it relevant? Are the experiments feasible? And is it going to move things forward? Our mechanisms are designed to get treatments, right? We get basic science proposals that are like, okay, we think that we want to study SOD1 mechanisms and how it affects something inside the cell because that would be useful for designing antisense for SOD1. Well, maybe that's not going to have much impact because there's already trials of antisense in SOD1, right? And so that's not a good fit impact-wise for, you know, even the basic science that's early. So what's the relevance? How is it going to change therapy development? And are the experiments going to get an answer, whatever the answer is?
So,
Yeah.
Dr. Ostrow or Dr. Passanelli, this may sound like a flippant question, and I don't mean it to be, but if the relevance is what we should be focusing on as reviewers, are we qualified to answer that question as consumers?
Yeah, so you are qualified, right? Because so first of all, as you know, in the peer review, like you're asked specific to do specific parts of the review, right? But we've defined it as best we can. What is impact? What is relevance in those statements? And so, for example, you're not the one who's being asked to say, is this the right mouse? Okay, that's not your role on that committee. That's somebody else's role. Okay, you're truly. That's not your role, even in those basic science ones. Like your job, I believe, in the basic science ones was that, you know, you were supposed to be reading the impact statement, right? And the lay abstract. And so the impact that you're judging is actually not the relevance of those models. The impact that you're judging, and you can think critically like anyone else, is, are these experiments going to, you know, move this on? If they do what they say they're going to do, and are they qualified to do it? Will we be further along in a therapy development? Will we know an answer? And we spell that out now. We didn't used to. But again, this is hard to talk about in abstract terms like this. It's much easier if we had like 45 minutes and gave you guys some exercises and gave you these actual pieces of paper. And the other thing, Allison, is, as you know, like there's this, the whole thing is done. There's the company GDIT, right, who does the training with you guys. And I don't want to reproduce that. And that isn't what we're being asked to do. But I want to make sure, like, it's a matter of understanding what it is that you're supposed to be asked to comment on. And you guys really are qualified to do that, even on the basic science. You know.
We do get it. I'm sorry.
I just wanted to say, I totally agree. Relevance, I didn't mean relevance, again, of the scientific merit, right? Relevance to the disease. Feasibility is something that I think we, as the scientific community, should be judging. Relevance is what is relevant for the disease in general, right? So even if I'm asking, oftentimes, even if I'm asking for a grant, right, that looks at a very, very, very small population of ALS patients because it's a very rare disease. In the big scheme of things, the scientific community may think that is not relevant. Ask those patients who have that mutation if it is relevant or not. Relevance in that respect. right? And I think it is very important simply to just.
So I saw the next question, which was Haristalina's about what's the percentage of funding, right? And so I just wanted to show, if you go to the website, which is what I just shared on my screen here. Whoop, is that the wrong document? So I know I just pulled it up last week for somebody else. I can, oh, did they move it? Hold on.
Funding summary.
It's here, information paper. So everything's on the website, and so this was this past funding cycle, right? And so these were the 4 awards, and for each of them, there's information on how many pre-apps we received, how many were invited to submit full, okay, how many completed ones we received, and again, this was our first year with these 2, and so that's partly why they're smaller. They're likely going to be much bigger this year, and we had already said that we were prioritizing these awards in that year, but this gives you an idea about those answers, Crystalina.
Thank you, Lyle.
Yeah.
Thanks so much, Lyle. And this is a great program, and that is quite a funding level for those of you who are unaware. This is really great, and great for ALS. And I'm thinking of stepping off the committee so I can submit a grant with this kind of funding level. I might actually have a chance.
So most people do, like, they serve 3 years on a programmatic panel and step off. And I'll tell you what, man, we just gave 40. I mean, this moves the needle like never before. And they're really exciting. And please go look at the website and look at, I mean, we just don't have time to talk about it, but this is cool stuff. And every year we do our best to refine it, and we're doing it based on the feedback we get from you. And, this is your program. So thank you.
Thanks so much, Lyle. And I think now we're going to hear from Todd. I saw Todd joined us. Todd has actually been a reviewer. You still, yeah, there's Todd.
Yeah, I'm here.
Good, good.
Yeah, I've been a reviewer for the past 2 years, and a lot of the questions that were just asked of Dr. Ostrow, I could have answered as well, going through it. Incredible program and a wonderful experience I had. What I want to say before I start talking is that if you do have any questions, you are assigned a person called your SRO, which is your Science Resource Officer. And this person is invaluable, because as you start reading the grants, the proposals, the things, you can contact him or her at any point and get feedback. I'm not allowed to say, because of confidentiality, who my SRO was or what her name was or anything like that. I will just say that my first year, it was a charming woman from, I think she was down in Alabama with a wonderful Southern accent. So maybe some of you will know who that is. And she was so helpful in making sure I understood exactly what I needed to do. And in fact, when you read your first proposal and you write a review, you send it to your SRO, who then gives you feedback, so you know you're doing the right thing before you do an additional 8 to 12 or whatever they ask you to do. All right, so anyway, here's what I'd like to say. First of all, I want to know, I've been a patient of Dr. Hyman Patterson's now since March of 2013. And although I've been doing this panel last 2 years, I didn't get into advocacy immediately, because I know a lot of people right now are wondering what they can do. Life happens. I had a lot going on. I had 2 sons in college. My daughter was still in junior high. My wife decided to go back to school and become a nurse, so she was doing that full time. We had a bucket list trip that some of my friends and the community sponsored, so we could go as a family to Ireland and England. I had to learn how to drive my car with hand controls and get those put in the car, because my legs were affected first. And I continued to teach. I managed to teach a full 6 years beyond my diagnosis. I was a high school English teacher and also the drama director, and I got to do that for many years as well. Honestly, I didn't have a lot of time for advocacy with all that going on. I did write the Season of Giving message back in 2014. I worked with a videographer, Tom Camano, on a video documentary about the ALS Hope Foundation, and I spoke at the gala back in 2018. my progress and my regression as far as ALS goes has been slow, which is a great advantage. It's given me an opportunity to adapt and to, plan, give me more time to plan. But since we're talking about trials and clinical trials, there's been a disadvantage to that. I was not eligible for most clinical trials. They want people who have fast progression so they can see that what they're doing is impacting that person. So I couldn't get into a lot of trials. And once I was past 3 years of diagnosis, they really don't want you in the trials anymore. So that was a little frustrating. But finally, in 2019, I had retired, and my wife and I think it was August or September of that year, took this CRLI training down in Philadelphia area. In fact, I noticed the picture you keep using, Dr. Hyman Patterson, is the same one from, I think it was the last time we did this without Zoom and it was live. Am I correct? Because I saw that picture again. And I did notice that, I just want to point out, I'm right in the front of the picture. The shirt I'm wearing is not the same shirt. It looks very much the same color, and it is the same color. I would have worn my Hawaiian shirt, but I didn't want to have to compete with Dr. Bedlack. So I figured the safest thing to do was to just, wear the shirt today. So anyway, when I took the CRLI training and my wife did, we were really excited. We were like, wow, what can we do with this now? What can I get involved in? And I'll tell you, it was difficult at first. There were things out there and I just didn't think they spoke to me. I didn't feel like I could contribute to them. And then of course the pandemic hit, which certainly limited the opportunities for in-person advocacy. So Niels sends out emails listing clinical trial opportunities, meetings, and other things that are important. And near the end of May 2020, this arrived in my mailbox. So I'm going to read it to you. And I got really excited about it. This is actually the program that, Dr. Ostrow was talking about. And I love his enthusiasm because he really is a big advocate for the program. So it said, I'm reading this now, individuals living with ALS or their caregivers, your input is needed to help review biomedical research proposals. General Dynamics Information Technology, GDIT, is contracted by the Department of Defense Congressionally Directed Medical Research Programs, CDMRP, to recruit individuals living with ALS or their caregivers to serve as consumer reviewers for the ALS research program, ALSRP. Okay, a lot of scary abbreviations there, but I figured I would push on no matter what. Consumer reviewers serve as on panels reviewing biomedical grant applications to support the development of highly innovative and impactful research. Consumer reviewers act as lay experts on ALS and bring their experience and perspectives to the evaluation of medical research applications. They represent the ALS community and provide crucial input to the panel, serving alongside scientific and medical experts to represent those most directly affected by the disease. Well, this sounded like something I was interested in. So I did go to the website and I found out all about the information. And that night when I went to bed, I couldn't sleep. It kept mulling over in my head. I really think this is something I could do. I wanted to have some impact on ALS research, and this is something I thought I could handle. Give me a second here. Okay, so I found out as a consumer reviewer, I would have a little more than a month to read several scientific research proposals, write short reviews for each, and then provide an initial score. And what makes it interesting with the scores, by the way, Dr. Ostrow didn't mention this, is initially when we score, we do a 1 to 10 scale, 10 being the highest. And then later on, when we score it a second time, we do the 1 to 5 scale. And they're trying to do that, and there are statistical reasons for that, which was explained to me at some point, which I can't remember, but it made sense at the time. Later, I would read the reviews of scientists and clinicians, and have the opportunity to revise my initial scores. Ultimately, the entire panel would meet in September for 2 days to discuss the proposals and provide scores. So let's see, it was reading, writing, and discussion. I was a high school English teacher for 35 years. This is exactly what I did. So I'm like, this is in my wheelhouse. I want to do this. So the next morning I said to my wife, I want to do this. So let's see about applying. So I had to do a number of things. I had to write my resume. Okay, I haven't done that in 20 years, but that was simple enough. I had to answer a number of questions. I had to do an interview, telephone interview with a wonderful woman who's in charge there, Melanie. And then I needed support from an ALS organization. So Dr. Terry Hyman Patterson wrote me, a recommendation for the ALS Hope Foundation. Okay. So after all that, I got the job. So some things that happened. I met with other ALS patients, pals and cows via Zoom. We all had like an introductory session, which is very helpful. It's a very inclusive group. If you are limited in some way, you can still serve on the panel. People with obviously difficulty with speaking can still be on the panel. If you can't type, you could have your cows involved in this. They'd have to sign the confidentiality agreements as well, but they could type for you. They really try to get, it's very inclusive. They want everyone involved. As a consumer reviewer, I was to focus on really 2 areas, the lay abstract and the impact statements. Now, I had the whole proposal available to me. So if I needed to read more to understand more what was going on, I could do that. But I really only had to read those 2 things because what I was looking at was scoring only initially what that impact would be. And like was said earlier, I had to remember I'm speaking for all ALS patients. Yes, my ALS is sporadic, but if the proposal was just for familial ALS, I still wanted to support that if it looked like it could have a wonderful impact there, because if that, I mean, anyone suffering with ALS deserves some kind of cure or some kind of help. And if we could find something there, who knows how it might be able to transfer over to the larger ALS community as well. I was, like I said, reading through them. Some things that I noticed going through there was, there was a learning curve. I had to look up a lot of things, a lot of times. I remember last year in particular, I remember commenting when we had our session that I think this particular scientist didn't understand what a lay abstract meant, because I thought it was more technical than the scientific abstract, which I was forced to read later on. And I think the scientists agreed with me on that. The other thing I laugh at is they use a lot of acronyms that I had to get used to. And, I'm used to that from education, but I wasn't used to the ones in this particular area. Like, for example, they have BBB. And of course, when I hear that, I think Better Business Bureau, but it is actually blood-brain barrier. And I saw that one came up a lot. By the way, try to say that 5 times quickly. That's a great tongue twister. And then there was another one, GLP kept coming up, and I was like, what the heck is GLP? So I had to look that up, and that's just good laboratory practices. There also, like I said, I had my SRO, my science resource officer. Well, I had to laugh at that one because when I was teaching in school, we had an SRO. It was the student resource officer. That was the cop in the building. So whenever I saw SRO, I'm still thinking of the cop. But it works both ways, folks. It does work both ways. When I was still teaching, I remember one time I had to send out to my department some information about an upcoming in-service about alternative learning strategies, which in their brilliance, the committee decided to abbreviate as ALS. Well, when I sent that out to my department members, half of them wouldn't open the document because they thought I had accidentally sent them something confidential about my treatment. So, I don't know who in their right mind would choose ALS as an acronym for something else. It's just like saying, I got a new product, let's call it NASA, and no one's going to confuse it. It's not going to happen. Okay. So the recruiter did caution me that there was going to be a lot of reading involved, but I was a high school English teacher. I read for years. Plus also I was an AP reader for the College Board, where we would read student essays for 7 days straight. So it was nothing. And like I said, I learned so much through the process. And I've realized too also that English teachers are not the only ones who use a lot of big words. Scientists do it all the time. And one of the other things, I'm sorry, this is kind of a tangent and anecdote, but the one I have to laugh about is a lot of times they talk about experiments on non-human primates. They always call them non-human primates. And it took me a minute, and then I realized, oh, you guys mean monkeys. That's what you mean. But I guess it's not politically correct. We could talk about the SOD1 or the SOD1 mouse all the time, but we just don't want to experiment on monkeys. So it's always non-human primates. The last 2 years, the panel has been done through Zoom. And of course, there's been an advantage to that. There was no travel, easy bathroom facilities. I could set up exactly what I needed. I put 2 computers here for this 2-day session in September. I had my materials at hand. But just like this Zoom session, you realized there are limitations to that. There were no really good meals to eat, although I guess you were doing Grubhub or something that at least helped with that. And there was no downtime for that networking to talk with these people on a personal level. And I did miss that. And the other thing is about right now, this Zoom format, where all you guys are on mute. So I'm getting, other than your facial expressions, I'm getting no feedback from you whatsoever. So if I say something which I think is remotely funny, I don't hear any laughter. Or if I say something that might be profound, I don't get that, profound awe moment there. And I really miss that, because as a high school English teacher, that's what I live by. I mean, basically, I had to get the feedback from my students so I'd have a sense of whether my lesson was getting across to them or not.
Todd, you muted yourself.
When did I mute myself? Just then?
Yeah.
Okay, sorry. Thank you.
20 seconds.
Yep.
I just wanted to finish this up. Okay. All right, so I'm almost done. While basically strict confidentiality prevents me from sharing most of the specifics, although, like Dr. Ostrow pointed out, I did find one of those examples of a medicine in search of a disease. One of those did come up the one year, and that's exactly what I saw it right away. And I'm not a scientist, but you can see when that's happening. And also there were times when, before we actually got to discussion, a proposal had been ranked low by everyone on the panel, in which case we really didn't waste the time to discuss that, because you only have 2 days to do this. I felt that my input was greatly valued, highly valued by the scientists and the clinicians. And any questions I had were always addressed by the panelists. And sometimes they even could bring in experts on a particular area to help with that. My score then also counted just as much as everyone else's score. And after I'd heard the discussion, I could give it a good, a solid evaluation that I thought was fair. And I think it was really exciting too. I've seen then which proposals the following year were actually funded. And I recognized vaguely some of those ones that I had commented on, and I felt there I'd had an impact. I had to remember, because we had to destroy all the materials that we had done at the time because of confidentiality, but it was neat to see that. I was incredibly impressed by the dedication, the expertise, and the personal commitment of the scientists and clinicians. They really care about finding an end to this horrible disease. Well, I recognized, folks, that the particular projects that I was evaluating probably would never affect me in my lifetime. I wanted to do what I could to help move the needle, move this direction, move the disease forward and the cure forward, so that it could impact PALS in the future. Although this panel work is not for everyone, I'll say that, it was perfect for me. And I think more people should get involved. And with They need to replace consumer reviewers who have left and need to add more. And I think they're currently recruiting through the end of May. My primary message for you guys is this, as ALS ambassadors now, new ones, find what works for you. I encourage you to find what the means you can be an advocate for. If you're great at organizing a 5K, go for it. You know, Gary Curtis can do that kind of stuff. I can't do that. If fundraising is your forte, pursue that. If you want to attend a political rally, more power to you. I just found that being consumer reviewer was something I could do, that I could feel I could have an impact. And I felt that it was a rewarding experience for me. And I would encourage anyone with any questions, you can contact me, or anyone who's, has any interest in this. It might be something worth pursuing, because it was a fantastic experience. And hopefully, like I said, I'm planning to continue to do it as long as I can.
Thank you, Todd. That was great. And you can see people clapping, and there's lots of comments. Rick thinks THP is Tennessee Highway Patrol. Just adding that. Allison commented that we get an opportunity to see the scientist reviews before submitting our own.
That's right. And one of the fascinating things is where you have perhaps two scientists debating something. I found listening to their debate and their arguments was actually very exciting, very stimulating.
And Kevin joked around a little bit about the profoundness of this presentation. And Jamie, of course, said, this is profound and Todd is awesome. And I think we all agree.
Thank you.
Allison says, Todd, you are amazing. I was also assigned a mentor consumer reviewer in my first year who was fantastic. You are probably a great mentor. Laurie said, Todd, thank you. Great presentation. Ristalina is also thanking you and Allison for volunteering to do this. Kevin says it was great. And Gary says, great work, Todd. And Sarah's clapping. So thank you, Todd, for talking a little bit about what it was like and what your experience was like as a consumer reviewer, which is an opportunity for people. And I know Stacy has applied. And so, we certainly hope that she gets chosen. And with this under your belt, Stacy, you can amend your application saying that you also took this course.
I told them that I was doing it.
Yeah.
So they've actually asked us, it's not a requirement, of course, but they have asked us specifically to give them lists of anyone that participates in the CRLI, because they think that this is a valuable, specifically. So the selection for the peer review and the programmatic review, totally separate. GDIT is a different company than does programmatic review, but we've been specifically asked to provide the names of people who complete the CRLI course, because the DoD thinks that it clearly.
And I think that one of the things that we'll talk about, at least, the faculty and certainly sort of talk with Rick about, is whether or not to include a little bit more about the CDRMP and how to review a grant.
I mean, the problem, so apologize. I realized I couldn't do what I had planned to do, but they've asked us. So there are other CDMRPs that do literally a week-long curriculum, right? But what it mostly is the science. It mostly is like a science boot camp on breast cancer or whatever it is. And then it also has the how to review, the grants. But and I don't want to reproduce that, but I do think, and maybe this is too much to do in part of this. Maybe it's a separate, session or whatever.
Yeah.
What they've asked, what we should do is much like you just did, Terry, where we have some examples and go through some aims and talk about, these sorts of things. Because the key thing, again, you don't have to really understand much of the science to understand the criteria that you're asked to evaluate, and whether something is, feasible, and whether it's impactful, and whether, it meets the criteria for a proposal.
It may be that, that we create a separate session that people can sign up for that we kind of advertise at CRLIs, that if you really are interested in this consumer, review, here's a program for you to learn how to do consumer reviews, and then we can put something together, because I think that it is important.
Allison, I just want to say one thing too, just so we're very clear. None of us freaking understand the science in a lot of those TIAs, right? Yeah. And like literally, okay. But what we figured out is how to check the boxes, right? I've got my cheat sheet in front of me, and if somebody, it's up to the researcher to prove to me that the model that they're using is relevant to the question they're asking, okay? And so if somebody's using, earlobe cells to measure the color of something, whatever, they have to prove to me in the proposal that this is a relevant measure for what they're trying to do. And so when I read these things, I don't think so much about understanding all the technical details. I think about what's the comparison, what's the thing that they're measuring? Do they have the right numbers? If there's guidelines for how to do it, are they doing that? Have they done this technique before? Like, these are all feasibility questions. I don't want to be judging on whether something's a good idea, because as we've talked about a lot, like, I'm a bad judge of that. If I wasn't a bad judge of that, we would have cured ALS already. Okay. So, we prioritize good experimental design, good rationale, good justification for what they're doing, and those things you guys are just as qualified as me to judge.
And I was going to say, Allison, last year I had one of those proposals that I was like, this is incredible. Can they actually do this? Can they pull this off? And I gave it a very high rating initially because I thought the impact would be fantastic. And then once I talked with the scientists, they brought me down to earth about whether this could be really practical or not. Because I remember saying that. I said, now my review is based only on its potential impact. I just can't imagine they can accomplish this, that someone hasn't done it already. And then the scientists and clinicians, they set me straight, and I realized it was a pie in the sky. But again, we were talking about high risk, high reward. This was an incredible high reward, but the risk was just, I think we didn't score it as high because it just seemed impractical.
So the other side of it that we should be honest about, and they do a really good job in the interviewing process of sharing this, is it's not just the science that we're reading that can be intimidating, but Lyle, being in a room or on Zoom with a bunch of you guys can be intimidating. And you're put on the spot to give your opinion. So people need to be really comfortable and secure in what they're doing.
Right. So that's yes, and we're on the same team, and we love you, and your wisdom is invaluable, much more so than anyone else's. And I'm sorry if that's the case, and we need to hear that feedback if that's ever the case on any of these panels, because that ticks me off, because we work for you. So and that's why
everybody's super nice.
Yeah, I mean
super open.
Yeah. And I will say, like, we do these for a lot, not just for, all of us, we review grants for like lots of different things. And the thing I love about the DoD one is I really feel that everybody's there to do the best job they can. Everybody's there to work together. And we routinely like change each other's opinions, right? It's not, all the time, like, I can't believe, when we discuss these things, it's not as if there's people dug in fighting about minutia. It's like, oh yeah, that's, we routinely change each other's opinions. And everybody's vote counts, and everybody's vote counts the same, right? It's not just the two primary reviewers, it's everyone in the room who votes on everything. And by the way, you guys all can come visit whenever you want. Yeah, no problem.
Yeah, so Rick says that Lyle should hold the boot camp at his castle, but in the summer, not the winter. And
this house is not wheelchair accessible, unfortunately. I wish it was, but yeah.
And Kevin is thanking Candy for the comment, and Allison likes the way Candy thinks.